Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Guida. I am the Director of Sustainability at AOS Architects here in Santa Fe and President of Friends of Architecture Santa Fe. I want to welcome everybody to Revisioning Housing. This is another installment of the Revisioning History series, which features leading community voices and the public in conversation about the future of our shared built environment by way of critically re-examining the way Santa Fe has historically made plans for our future. Revisioning Housing is the fourth of our in-depth sessions in this series and follows previous discussions on planning, preservation, and sustainability. As you may know, these are all provocative sessions, and by design, they're about deeply interrelated topics in Santa Fe's built environment. Accordingly, all sessions are recorded and archived on our website for additional viewing. A brief note about Friends of Architecture before we move on to tonight's session. We are an independent nonprofit. We create informed conversations about design in the built environment towards a more vibrant, equitable, and sustainable Santa Fe. Panel discussions in the Revisioning History series are but one of our programs. Our other public offerings include design charrettes, tours, and Pechacucha. To learn more, please visit architecturesantafe.org. A brief outline of tonight's session. This is a 2-hour session, 120 minutes total. In the first half, we will have a series of 10-minute presentations by our host and our speakers. In the second half, we'll do a moderated panel discussion with interactive audience Q&A. AIA members, NMASLA members, and NMAPA members will earn 2 learning units or continuing education credits tonight. This is intended to be a participatory event. Please use the Q&A button to submit your questions as we go along. I will be moderating tonight, and our team will be feeding your questions to me behind the scenes, and we'll try our best to get through to all of them. You're certainly welcome to submit questions anonymously. But we would otherwise like you to include your name if you're willing to do so when your question is put to the panel. If your question is aimed at a particular speaker, please say so in the Q&A. Okay, main event. I'm going to introduce tonight's host, Friends of Architecture board member Carlos Gemora. Carlos is an urban planner working to facilitate creative changes in the built environment. He is focused on transformative change, specifically regarding land use, affordable housing, socioeconomic justice, and long-term infrastructure planning. He's the right one to put together a session on housing in Santa Fe. Carlos studied regional community-based facilitative planning practices at Cornell University and at Evergreen State College, and has previously worked in New York and Washington State. He volunteers his time with educational nonprofits like Big Brothers Big Sisters and the Telluride Association. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And I also want to give a thanks to Chris Longley-Postema, Gayla Bechtel, and Lisa Roach. That's the team that's been putting together these revisioning housing workshops. And without them, we'd really be lost. I also want to give a special thanks to Daniel Werwath, Joseph Montoya, Lucy Foma, Michael Barrio, everyone I've talked to at HomeWise, Rosemary Romero, Jamie Blosser, and Michael Pride for talking with me and helping me frame this talk and the different panelists that you'll hear from tonight. So tonight we are going to be talking about systematic housing issues. As many of you know, we are starting to get more housing than ever before. And while our community has worked hard on the affordable housing issue, we still have lots and lots of problems. Our housing markets are stressed, development is challenged, and everyone seems to be frustrated for different reasons. We know that we need more affordable housing. We need more home ownership. We need more rental housing. We know that the current systems are either not working enough or working against what we want. Incomes are not keeping up with housing costs. Gentrification is occurring in our neighborhoods, change is occurring in our neighborhoods, and the poor and middle class are becoming increasingly unable to live in Santa Fe. The great news is that we have an excellent group of nonprofit partners, affordable housing entities, and even quite a few developers that are trying to provide this community with the things that we might need, like additional housing. But they're struggling to keep up with our demands. And one of the core needs that we have is more housing. The fact is that if we want affordable housing for low-income families, if we want it for middle-income families, even if we want it for high-income families, we need more housing. We do not have enough housing right now to support a healthy and affordable housing environment. We don't have enough housing to keep up with our population growth. And despite all of our best efforts, the problem has gotten worse in recent years. The bad news, though, is that we as a community don't really have our values figured out. Or more accurately, we don't really have a prioritization of our values figured out. We express in letters to the editor and yard signs and public meetings that we want more housing, but our actions, regulations, and statements sometimes conflict with that. Sometimes these different types of values aren't really either ors, and we could come up with innovative ways to get everything we want, but oftentimes we have to choose between different values. We have to choose what is more and what is less important. For the last 20 years, our community has been saying that it wants affordable housing, but then simultaneously saying that we only want housing if it meets a high quality of life, if it provides a lot of amenities, if it results in minimal traffic impacts, if it doesn't impact views. Most importantly, if it doesn't have any negative impacts for the surrounding neighbors. An example I like to point to is the 1999 general plan. And in that plan, we say that our top priority is affordable housing, which is great. But we also say that we are concerned with uncontrolled growth and development. We're concerned with the loss of tradition. We're concerned with open space. We're concerned with traffic congestion and parking. And so our community is concerned with the very types of things that housing often brings with it. It means that we have expressed a lot of opposition to large projects. We've expressed opposition to tall projects, opposition to dense projects, opposition to projects with a lot of neighbors. Another plan that we have is the downtown, Santa Fe Downtown Vision Plan. And in that plan, we similarly say that affordable housing is a goal, but we also say that we are concerned about housing that might take up parking, or housing that might take up open space, or housing that might add height, or housing that could add massing. And so I think it's kind of funny that in this plan, there's this diagram that says that we want additional housing, but we want to increase different setbacks so that it's not visible. So we could have housing as long as it's invisible housing. This is an example of housing not being a top priority. In this case, the top priority is the preservation of an architectural character. And so if we want to get into these issues, the common debate pits us between additional housing and existing quality of life. So additional housing, whether we like it or not, does bring more neighbors. And we have to evaluate to what degree do we want more neighbors, or do we want to maintain small town charm? To what degree do we want more or less traffic? To what degree do we want more families or more of a quiet city? To what degree do we want to be a diverse city or a homogeneous city? There's a lot of gray area in between these. And there's a lot of discussion that we have to have between these different values. But something that makes this really difficult is that as a city, we've kind of abandoned comprehensive long-range planning. We've abandoned a lot of times types of community engagement that's involved discussing these. So for the last 25 years, we haven't really gotten into these issues as an entire city. I'm not focusing on water too much. I don't think that water is the biggest concern when we're talking about housing. According to the Water Division, since 1995, our water usage has gone down by around 25%, despite our population going up 42%. So that means that our water usage per capita has more than halved in the last 25 years. Additionally, our annual supply has gone up 66%. So the water issue is definitely a concern. We definitely have to be thinking about how climate change can be affecting our water security going into the future. But even if we didn't have additional conservation, even if we didn't have additional infrastructure like a return flow pipeline, we could feasibly achieve a sustainable population of 125 to 160,000 people. What does impact housing quite a bit is our regulations and how we bring in additional housing. Our existing land use code maximizes community welfare for existing residents. Makes a lot of sense. It minimizes the negative impacts of new development. So it's minimizing the effect of new residents. That makes sense. The problem is that it leads to very expensive regulations. It leads to inequitable regulations, leads to costly approval. It encourages building as expensive as possible rather than as affordably as possible. And overall, it leads to an unhealthy housing ecosystem. A great example I like to think of, and I worked a lot with this when I was with the city, was a developer comes in, wants to build a couple units and has to have some baseline level of return. We use the land use code to decrease the amount of units they're able to have, decrease the height, decrease the size of it, which adds a lot of costs. Additionally, there's community processes that want additional amenities like trees. I love trees and I love landscaping, but all of that adds costs to development. And that's something that we have to balance. Another example is how we zone our city. So 80% of our residential land is zoned as extremely low density residential. And 80 to 95% of all of the land, residential land in Santa Fe is zoned too low to support affordable housing. So if you look at this, you could think about all of the yellow, all of the light blue, and all of the gray as not being able to support affordable housing. Another way we could simplify that is drawing big X's around here and just saying that housing is not available, that we are not allowing additional housing throughout massive amounts of the city. Another way to think about this is that we are artificially creating exclusive zones that exclude people from locating in those areas. And this has led to severe racial and economic segregation between different neighborhoods. So the culminating question that we have is, to what degree do we want to be an inclusive or an exclusive community? A fully inclusive community would mean that anyone, regardless of income, could live in Santa Fe. Perhaps it would mean that we want housing to be considered a human right. It would certainly mean more housing. It would mean more traffic. It would mean more neighbors on the streets, which is a huge shift from where we're at today. Another hard thing for homeowners to hear is that if we wanted a healthy, affordable housing market, it would mean that rather than trying to use our regulations to increase the value and cost of housing, we would try to do the opposite, trying to use our regulations and policies to maintain that or to lower the cost of general housing. And so this process either involves a neutral city entity to bring together and convene different community members, or it requires the community to do that itself. Either way, it really does rely on the community to take control over conversations around values, to take control over conversations around how we want to develop as a city. So tonight, I've got 4 different panelists. We have Tomás, Rivera, Jennifer Jenkins, Drew Finke, and Joel Mills. And then, as Anthony was saying, we'll move to questions and answers. Let me end this. And Tomás, are you available? Do you want to start sharing your screen?
Sure, thank you. Let's see if I can share my screen correctly.
Thank you. So Tomás is the executive director of Chainbreaker. He's been in that role since 2004. Chainbreaker is a membership-led economic and environmental justice organization With over 700 dues-paying members in Santa Fe, the bulk of whom are residents of neighborhoods experiencing divestment and are vulnerable to gentrification and eviction. Chainbreaker organizes frontline community members directly impacted by housing, transit, and civil rights issues to make Santa Fe a more equitable city. Thank you very much, Tomás, for being here, and kick it off whenever you're ready.
Cool. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, everybody, for having us here today. Yeah, as you said, Chainbreaker is a membership-based organization here in Santa Fe. We work on transportation and housing issues through a civil rights and racial justice lens. I really appreciated how you set the stage there talking about values. Chainbreaker has been doing anti-displacement work here in Santa Fe for about 15 years through our various forums. And so we want to share some of the things that we've learned in terms of what are the current dynamics. We want to share some of the values that we lead with as an organization that we would like to see the city start taking on more. In some cases, it has taken that on. We want to see it take it on more. In some cases, it hasn't taken it on at all. We want it to take on at all, just at all. And then we want to dream a little bit about what it could look like, what the world could look like if we actually led with our values of housing as a human right. So I'm just going to start by defining a few terms real quick. Just want to define a couple terms. The first one is equity. We talk about equity. We talk about equity a little bit. A lot throughout this. And so I think what equity is to us, we talk about equal access to resources and equal exposure to risks. We want to be clear that equity is not the same thing as equality. And sometimes people get those two things conflated in their minds. To us, equity is about seeking to restore previous harms and prevent future harms. It is fundamentally, in and of itself, about shared responsibility, collective responsibility, and justice. So I think that it kind of, this is just a thing we took off the internet. That's a common little diagram that people have drawn to articulate visually what equity looks like. And what one, I guess, artist's way that they wanted to predict it. Now, there is a lot of ways of thinking about equity. This picture, there's a lot of ways of making this picture and critiquing this picture. I'd encourage you to just jump on Google and do some of that yourself. But for just kind of the basic 101 is a good way to start. So let's see. I'm gonna just take a second here. It looks like I'm having some issue with screen share. So I'm gonna try to fix that for just 1 second. I apologize for that. How about this? Is this better? I'm going to. Is that right?
It's still on presenter view.
What does that mean?
Chris, try going to display settings.
Okay, I think I know what happened here. Let's see.
Okay, and you could also try sharing just the full screen.
Is that did that make it
perfect?
Better?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Keep going.
Sorry
Thanks.
about that, y'all. I'm not good at technology. You think that I would figure out how to do Zoom after a year and a half of living on it, but thank you for your patience there. So I'm going to move on to talk about the next thing that we like to define, which is gentrification. So for us, when we talk about gentrification, the first thing that we need to think about, because people ask us, what makes gentrification happen? Typically we all know what we're talking about with gentrification. There is often an old historic neighborhood, it's usually low income, people of color. There's a sudden influx of resources and the market swings and increases displacement pressure and changes the demographic makeup of the city. Of the neighborhood and pushes people out. This is something that's been happening in Santa Fe for decades. It's something that happens in cities all across the country and all across the world. The first waves of gentrification, really started in 1492. This is kind of the gentrification is the legacy of that. But we saw that post World War II. We saw a big wave. We saw another big wave in the 80s and 90s. In the 2000s, and now we're on the cusp of yet another one. And again, what makes that, what's a core issue that drives gentrification has a historic disinvestment. And that means both public and private sector investments, such as parks and trails and that kind of stuff, as well as jobs and things like grocery stores and street maintenance, all of that. So it involves increasing housing prices. Initially, it's for renters who tend to be less protected, but also moves into home ownership as well. And then you see an influx of residents with higher incomes, more resources, and better able to access power. Meaning they're able to talk to city councilors, they're able to talk to corporations, they're able to work and have influence over some of those decisions. And the result is the displacement of renters, particularly first renters, and low-income residents and people of color. And so I'm going to get to a little bit to just articulate a little bit more why we talk about this and frame this as a civil rights issue and a racial justice issue. But I want to just show the dynamics for folks on this call who are not in Santa Fe or as familiar with this issue. This is Santa Fe. This is just a map, again, we pulled off of the internet someplace, looks like BLM. Most of, and this is pre-COVID times, of course, although it's still current, most of the job market in Santa Fe is tourism industry, so service industry. And that's located right downtown where that is. But that is not accessible for the folks that work there in terms of housing costs. So people wind up moving in this direction. And so this is the area over here, the airport road corridor. Sometimes people refer to this as the south side. As you can see, it's not actually the south side. And we like to name things instead of sort of creating those shortcuts for people. But it's not just there that they're moving. The lucky people are living in that area, right? People are moving farther north towards Espanola and Rio Rancho, and just outside of the city. However, and Chainbreaker also is an environmental justice organization. So people still live in Santa Fe. People still work in Santa Fe, even if they don't live in Santa Fe. A high percentage of people who work in Santa Fe commute into the city. Now, what that does is that drives up CO2 emissions. That also drives up the costs for people in their pocketbooks. So car dependency in that way is an incredibly expensive thing. Many of our members spend as much as a third of their income on transportation, which means that they work 4 months out of the year just to get to and from work. And so this is kind of that cycle of displacement and toxins in our air, water, and soil, and also in the economic impact to our people. So why is this a racial justice issue? Why are we talking about it in terms of civil rights? Well, we know that historically and also currently, gentrification impacts communities of color. This is the case in our city. This is the case in cities across the country. This is a systemic issue. You can see that nationally, 40% of Black and Latino residents are housing insecure compared to 25% of the population, meaning that they're much higher percentage, I'm much more likely to be in a situation where they're right on the brink of displacement. Santa Fe's residents are rent burdened. Over half of us are. That means that a third of our income is going to rent. About 1 in 5 of us are severely rent burdened, which means half of our income is going to rent. And again, these are sort of indicators to predict what is the likelihood of that displacement happening. And so again, in Santa Fe, just like around the country, that predominantly impacts, disproportionately impacts residents of color. In Santa Fe, we recently done a study that showed on evictions that demonstrated the risk of eviction and also displacement is highly concentrated in neighborhoods of color. So you can, and in fact, when people talk about health indications and social determinants of health and housing, they will often talk about zip codes and housing insecurity as if they're almost the same thing. And in many cases, they are. So again, we know that we have this, we've seen this in several waves, and this is what it looks like. So this is based on a report that we did a few years ago. It's the most recent census data that is available. It is not the 2020 census data, but the 2010 census data. And this just shows the displacement of residents of color, particularly Latino residents in Santa Fe here. So just, can you all see my cursor on this screen? Or is it just the presentation?
We can see it.
Oh, great, okay. So you can see here, these neighborhoods that are red and orange is a high percentage of loss of Latino residents. So in some of these areas, this is Cerrillos for some reference here. This is St. Francis. So this is like the Baca Street area right around here. Almost 20%, 13%, 10%. And these are going to be significant in a little bit when you see what the actual percentage of residents is there. These are actually half of the residents lost in the last 20 years. And just want to call to mind that these are areas that were already highly gentrified prior to 2000. So it's pretty stark. And again, you can see that movement of people. As the color turns into green, you can see that means that there's an increase in Latino residents. So what does that mean? Carlos, you had shown a slide earlier about the racial demographics of Santa Fe. This is just another one. This is again from our health impact assessment study, where you can see what the neighborhood disparities are, right? There's some neighborhoods that are almost 90% Latino, 72% Latino, and some that are 90% white. If you look at that, we want to draw attention. This report specifically was comparing 4 neighborhoods: the Airport Road Corridor, Hopewell Man, and Downtown and Canyon Road. And we can share the links to the reports so you can see the full reports. We just want to call attention to some of the geography of what we're talking about here. So Hopewell Man is where many of our members live. It's by far where the bulk of our members live. It is also the poorest neighborhood in the city. So if you look significantly, why again we want to challenge people about referring to this area as the South Side. Often what they're saying is that's where poor people live, or that's where poor Latino people live, or something like that, right? That's kind of the code that we hear a lot. But there's actually some wealth in Santa Fe. This is Tierra Contenta over here in this area. So I will come back to that in a second, but this is what that disparity looks like in terms of income. When we talked about investment and the history of disinvestment, this is just a slide from our report about parks and where parks are built. Once again, please take a note of Hopewell Man here. This is an old neighborhood. I live in this neighborhood. My family has lived here for 4 generations. My house is almost 100 years old. This is not a new neighborhood, and it still has almost no parks in terms of this area over here. And you can even see the disparities between the 2 sides sort of Airport Road here with Tierra Contenta and the other sides of the city in terms of where parks are. I also want to point out that this report was done 6 years ago, I guess. And the city is reporting the full phase of the Swan Park being built here. But the reality is that it's only been constructed 1/3 of the way. So we've only seen 1/3 of the Swan Park. So this acreage is actually reporting 3 times what is actually there. And so that history of disinvestment is really important to note. And again, we want to make the point about why do we talk about this as a civil rights issue, is because the uniting factors between the investment is not necessarily income as much as it is race. And so that's kind of we wanted to just lead with that because we're talking about values. Again, Chainbreaker is a civil rights organization. We think that these conversations tend to be uncomfortable, but they're really important if we want to get the full scale and understanding of the housing situation here in Santa Fe. If we want to be values-based and we want to move towards what Chainbreaker believes is the right direction of housing as a human right, we need to humanize housing. We need to think about the people inside the housing as much as the structures, if not more. And I know I'm on a call with architects and developers. And so we want to encourage you, we are not architects or developers at Chainbreaker. We are not builders. We do not provide services. We are about people. And so we want to, again, humanize the housing structure. So what are some of the ways we can change the way that we think and change the way that we prioritize our values? Well, one thing there's a couple dynamics that are currently happening right now that we think are examples of a different way of thinking about housing in this country. So first and foremost, of course, everybody has lived through, well, I'm sorry to say, actually, that's not the case, but all of us on this call have dealt with the pandemic. And we know that one of the biggest issues outside of the immediate COVID health component of it was this tsunami of evictions that's coming. So early on, several jurisdictions, including the national, the state, and the local, imposed an eviction moratorium. And I could go into that. We are also in the midst of a 3-series report on evictions in Santa Fe, 2 of which have been released, which we're happy to share. And the data that we're presenting is from those reports. But it's important to think about those moratoria. And again, our city was actually one of the first to act there. We have a state level protection and a CDC, Center for Disease Control moratorium in effect right now that is scheduled to end at the end of this month. Now we know that when these moratoriums end, they're kind of the Scotch tape, not even duct tape, they're kind of the Scotch tape that's holding people in their homes. But that's more than we've had before. The idea of protecting people from being put out into the streets because they haven't been able to pay their rent is a significant shift in values towards a different understanding of how we think about housing as a society. From our perspective, when these moratoriums came into place, there was a legal affirmation that health is more important than making people pay their rent. And so, I think that we did that. We launched that as a society before figuring out the details of it because we were leading with that value. So some of the things from our report showing just how deep into that crisis we are is we've seen rising housing costs in our city. That again is not unique, it's across the country. Our report has shown that almost 6,000 people are at direct risk of being evicted when the moratorium expires. This number is likely significantly higher for many reasons that I won't go into this presentation, but we do invite you to read the report to find out those details. 55% of residents lost employment since December. 27% of renters in New Mexico are saying that they're self-reporting that they feel like it's very likely that they will be evicted. And so this is what that looks like. Here's another map of where the risk of eviction happens. Now this one was in 2017 to 19, right before the pandemic started. So you can see that disparity already at play. Now once those moratoria went into place, there was a drop of about half of evictions in our city. So evictions are still happening, to be clear, but they're still concentrated in the areas that we were pointing out before. They're particularly in low-income areas of color. And so again, want to highlight this area right here. We're going to come back to that in a second. So I want to just pause before I shift there. I just wanted to mention the eviction crisis. That's something that Chainbreaker is working deeply on, but just want to plant the idea again that this is a different way of thinking and leading with different values. So another thing that's important in Santa Fe right now is Midtown, right? So this 64-acre city-owned land that is right here in the middle of the city. So once again, we talk about what are the different threats and opportunities here. This is again the city, this is the racial breakdown. Midtown is right here. This is the area that is immediately walkable from Midtown. So these are the areas that are going to be most directly impacted. Here is again through income, there's Midtown. This is that disparity there, or this is that effect there. We want to bring up Midtown because we know that this is a critical development that's happening in Santa Fe. Again, we can look at these areas that are already at risk of gentrification and displacement right now, knowing that Midtown, which is literally right across the street, can be an opportunity or a threat. And I think that that's something that we're struggling with as a city right now. What values do we lead with? We know that Midtown is expensive. There is debt service on it. But we also know that investment in the community and hearing what the community, particularly the people in this area, which are the ones most impacted by it and the folks most vulnerable to being displaced by it potentially. What do we need there and what do we see there? So we want to encourage us as we talk about housing, as a human right, to start leading with our values, to start humanizing housing, and to really understand that we cannot move forward in development or housing of our city in a way that leads with values, unless our values are we're happy with a segregated city in this way. We need to shift those thinkings. And we think that there are ways of doing that. We're happy to continue the conversation about how and to provide those solutions, but I know my time is running out. So with that, I think I will just say thank you for this. And once again, we really want to continue this conversation. You can find our reports on the website, and perhaps we can share them out with you afterwards.
Tomás, thank you so much. And yeah, as Tomás said, lots of really good reports that Chainbreaker has released. Go and check those out, and we'll try to figure out if we could send some of those through email as well. I think it's really important to start a conversation about housing as a human rights issue to help us frame this not just as something technical, but as centralizing our conversations around the real human scope of the problem. And so again, thank you very much, Tomás, for helping us think more systematically and thinking about that core of the issue. Jennifer, are you available?
Yes, I am. Hi, Carlos.
Hi, Jennifer. You want to start sharing your screen?
I am ready to go.
Thank you. So Jennifer has a degree in business, spent a career in mortgage finance, became the vice president of a regional construction and development firm, and now has her own consulting firm, Jenkins Gavin. In that role, she makes key planning, management, and entitlement contributions, and is also the president of the board of the Regional Development Corporation, and also serves on the board of the Santa Fe Rail Yard Park Conservancy. And whereas Tomás was talking more around the human side of this issue, we brought Jennifer on to talk about her vast experience in the development side of this issue. So Jennifer, thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jennifer Jenkins with Jenkins Gavin. Really happy to be here. And yeah, my perspective obviously is going to be a little different. And I think that, you know, we've talked a lot about how there seems to be a lack of understanding, I think, among just the general populace about the development process and what that entails, and really where their opportunities lie that we can, you know, really forge some real change in our community. So this is, you know, being somewhat, you know, tongue-in-cheek here and a little provocative with some of the imagery, but you know, anybody who's lived in Santa Fe for any period of time has experienced, you know, Santa Fe is kind of your classic boomtown, and it's experienced a lot of development pressure over the years. I've been involved in development here in Santa Fe for 27 years, probably. So I've seen I've lived here for 32 years. I've seen an enormous amount of change, and one of the sort of easy sort of, you know, things and that people kind of resort to is the concept of the greedy developer. And it's like, you know, why does everything have to be so expensive? The developer could make it more affordable. Why don't they do more affordable housing? Why don't they do this, do that? And it's just greed. And that is something that I've heard for years. And yes, I think in any industry, you have your good players and your bad players. And I think that you have people who are motivated strictly by greed. And you have those that really want to do something. It's their work, it's their passion, it's how they contribute to our society. If you're sitting in a house that you didn't build with your own two hands, you probably have a builder or developer to thank for that. If you go to work in an office building that you didn't build with your own two hands, you probably have a developer to thank for that as well. And where you go shopping and all of that. So, you know, the private sector development community is an important cog in the wheel for meeting our community's needs in a lot of ways around housing and around economic development and business and services. So there's a lot of myths, you know, that really have been generated. You know, if you more houses, they're going to lower my property values, reduce my quality of life. And Carlos touched on some of these things in his introduction. Rental housing. I mean, apartments equal crime. I mean, I hear it all the time. And there's more negative community impacts. And then it's just the classic kind of NIMBY viewpoint versus being more pro-community and being more inclusive. So as we all know, home prices are skyrocketing in our community. I mean, this is just what's been happening in the last 4 years. I mean, it's astonishing. And it is something that really does need to be addressed. And I don't know if I would characterize what we're experiencing now as sort of a quote unquote bubble, similar to what we experienced prior to the recession. I think this is a little bit of a different thing. I think we have a major supply and demand issue. There's a lot of demand. Supply is not keeping pace. Interest rates are historically low, so that also generates demand. And also, in our we're kind of moving into a post-COVID reality. And we think communities like Santa Fe are going to become really desirable as people kind of move away from the coast, and especially when people realize they can work from anywhere. So I think we're going to still experience a fair amount of pressure for internally with our own residents, looking to get into home ownership, but also with newcomers. So, and, part of why I really wanted to do this panel this evening, it's really about education. And when we can all understand, because there's all these elements of our community that have their own viewpoint and they have their mission. We have this, we have our regulatory agencies, the city of Santa Fe and Santa Fe County. We have the development and the construction community. We have our residents, and then we have our business community. And all of this needs to work together. And when everybody's just pointing fingers at why things are the way they are, why things aren't working, or why things are so expensive, there is a ton of finger pointing that goes on. And so it really is about everybody understanding the viewpoints of all the other elements here. And so the viewpoint that I'm trying to share this evening, of course, is somewhat from the business community, but also from the development standpoint as well. So development is not easy, and it is incredibly risky. It is time consuming, it's expensive, and it takes a really long time. And there is just within the city and the county, the way that the regulatory entitlement process is set up is depending on the size and the scope of the project. A developer can easily drop $250,000 before his application even is in the door at the city in order to have his proposal reviewed. And that's even if the property is currently properly zoned. You can submit an application to the city that complies with 100% of everything in the city and the county, and you comply with the zoning, you comply with all the design standards, all the dimensional standards, your use, everything is completely tidy, and you can still have issues. And it'll still take, it could take 12 months, it could take 24 months, even to get to a point where you can get a building permit. And so the process typically starts with, a concept, and then there's, acquiring land and the feasibility process, and then getting something designed and planned and getting it entitled. Then you got to raise equity and you got to get it financed. And then you can finally move into construction. And one of the things that I repeat this a lot, and it's a really important factor here, is that it doesn't matter how deep the developer's pockets are. I mean, yes, they need to be financially capable of attracting debt and attracting equity. But every project has to stand on its own. It has to be economically and financially viable on its own merits. So if there's just continual extractions like, oh, it can't be too tall, or, oh, you got to plant more trees, or, oh, you got to do this, and, oh, you have to build a traffic signal down the street, and, oh, you need to do this, and you need to do that. At a certain point, the project doesn't make sense anymore. I mean, nobody's going to go to work and not get paid. And so developers have a margin that they need to achieve. And these margins are not enormous. That is the other thing, is especially on like multifamily projects, the margins aren't huge. And so every little bite out of that apple that you take, it can really move a project. I mean, I've had clients pull the plug. It's like, it doesn't pencil. It just doesn't make sense. So they're not going to do it. And we experience part of the challenges that we're experiencing now in Santa Fe relative to affordable rental housing is a result of the city adopted affordable housing regulations, inclusionary zoning, and they had a set of standards for sale housing, and then they had a separate set of standards for rental housing. And the standards for rental housing was that 15% of the units as part of the project, so if you did a 200 unit apartment project, you would have 30 affordable units as part of that project that would be built there. And because of the economics of multifamily projects, since that got adopted, there were no market rate projects built in Santa Fe. We had tax credit projects and that were, using federal funding to reach even a deeper level of affordability. But in terms of a regular for-profit developer coming in and building a project and doing the 15%, nobody did it because it really made the projects infeasible. By the time, with construction costs and the cost of land, and you got to buy the water and the fees, and you put all those things together, it didn't make sense. And they couldn't get projects financed. It's really about the banks, because very few of these projects are getting built with cash. So you've got to raise equity and you got to go to a bank. And so, and that created a huge issue with us. As Carlos said earlier, our supply is not keeping pace with demand. And so the city a few years ago established a fee in lieu option for rental housing in order to generate supply. And I know that's been a very controversial decision, but it actually has worked very, very well in generating more supply. So we have a lot of new housing coming online. Some of it already has, and there's more in the pipeline that's coming forward because the city made it feasible. And they made it where, they're collecting money that's going to the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is fantastic. And the city is now committing more monies to that trust fund to support affordable housing efforts. But that was, again, it was a controversial decision, but I believe it was the right decision in order to address the supply side of the issue. Oops, excuse me, I did not mean to do that. Pardon me 1 second. So I think I skipped a slide. No, I didn't. There it is. So, and the regulation sort of framework is really challenging. So this little cartoon kind of speaks to that, the proverbial red tape, and it does, time is money, and the regulatory environment can be challenging. And I think that's when we talk about what can be done. We know it's hard and we know it's time consuming and it's expensive. But we have different elements of our community that can participate. The development community the private sector is not going to solve this problem. They're not capable of solving this problem on their own. It's a community-wide issue when we talk about housing equity. And so there need to be community-wide solutions for that. And so, as I just spoke to, the private sector is limited on how much they can do and for projects to remain viable. And with an affordable housing requirement on rental housing that didn't work, we got no housing. So basically we had the law of unintended consequences. We ended up with a housing crisis due to a misplaced effort to create affordable housing. And so, and a lot of these costs are fixed. Sticks and bricks, as we call it. Construction materials costs are going through the roof, but those are fixed costs, and the fees are fixed costs, and your consultants, your architects, your engineers, all those things are fixed costs. So where is there an opportunity for there to be any movement in a way that that cost can be reduced on a project, so you do have more room to be more affordable? And one of the only places is in the land. So, collaboration is key. We have our for-profit sector, we have our nonprofit, we have amazing not-for-profit housing organizations in Santa Fe, especially for a community of this size. We are really, really fortunate with, HomeWise and the Santa Fe Community Housing Trust and Habitat for Humanity. These organizations do amazing work in this community, and I work with them myself. And so we really need to look at how do we collaborate, because there's a lot of things the private sector does really well. and that the public sector does not, and vice versa. And so we need to look at those opportunities for collaboration. But the city and the county, they can donate land, they can waive fees, they can provide water, they can streamline that red tape process, similar to the model that the city has adopted in the link overlay along St. Michael's Drive, removing the uncertainty and the risk and the time and reducing costs that it takes to get projects approved and to get them under construction. And so there are a lot of things in the city and the county's toolbox, but it requires commitment, and it requires an assessment of what are our values that Tomás was speaking to. If this is important, and the city, you know, is dedicating additional $300,000 or $3 million to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I don't want to misspeak, so maybe somebody at the end can correct me there. But committing money to the trust fund that can then be deployed in the community for these types of efforts. But you know, the city right now, they have a lot of their real estate assets for sale, and I'm kind of disappointed about that. I think it'd be much more dynamic if the city says, look, we're going to give this land away to a developer who brings us an affordable housing program proposal, and it's going to be competitive, and whoever gets it gets the dirt for free. And that is the way you can really mandate and create real affordable housing in this community. And again, there's a lot more that the city can do around incentives for the private sector. And again, opportunities to be more nimble and flexible in terms of how we generate affordable housing and how the private sector and the nonprofit sector can work together. And lastly, all of it takes political will. I know the city tried to do an affordable housing project. I know it was probably within the last 8 to 10 years at the property they own on Zia and Yucca, where the handball court is. They wanted to partner with, I believe it was with a nonprofit to do affordable units right there. Couldn't even get it done politically because the neighborhood came unglued, and they couldn't get it done. And that was really, really unfortunate. And so political will is key, but you know, the tide is turning a little bit. And I have been working and been part of the team working on the Zia Station project that you might be familiar with. And it was, this is a little snapshot when I was on the news, and this project had a fair amount of controversy associated with it. But it was a really important project, and we had to amend the general plan, we had to rezone the property, and we got it done. And it required a lot of political will. And so I really acknowledge our decision makers, our staff, and the city council, because you know, we were able to do this through the provision of affordable housing, transportation equity around multimodal transportation. There were a lot of elements of this that were really important for the city, and really complied with the city's stated goals and objectives around mixed use and housing and transportation in our community. So I do think the tide is turning politically, but a lot of this is, you know, sometimes going to require unpopular decisions. And that's why I think the education piece is so important in terms of the community, of everybody getting around a table, talking about values, talking about, you know, things we want to preserve. But what we need to preserve are people in this community. People are more important than buildings. So thank you very much for your attention. Be happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And yeah, make sure that you were put in questions if you have them. We've got that Q&A thing, and we'll try to get to those. Jennifer, you focus on the development side, but also the people side, and that's a real complementary part of what Tomás was talking about the potential limitations of the market and how we can move forward. Next, we have Drew Finke. Drew, if you're available, you could start sharing your screen. Drew is an associate with Opticos Design in Berkeley, California, and works on planning, urban design, and architecture projects. Drawing on his architectural education, Drew seeks to sustain and strengthen local culture through thoughtful, community-driven design and policies, and those that reinforce a community's unique sense of place. He's applied that kind of sensibility to award-winning plans from Tennessee to Hawaii and is now doing some work in Santa Fe. Drew, thank you very much for being here. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Like Carlos had mentioned, I'm going to be talking a lot about this idea of missing middle housing during my 10 minutes. I'm going to start my stopwatch now. But before we get into that sort of specific, I want to zoom out a little bit and try to contextualize some of the conversation that I'll be posing and that we've heard tonight as we think about a bigger question of where does housing go? And this is a city that, this is a question that any city is sort of challenged with. And we've already heard a little bit tonight about what that specific challenge looks like in Santa Fe. So for just a couple slides here, I wanted to share some ideas, share some work that we've done at Opticos in answering this question in some communities across the country. As Carlos mentioned, we're super excited to be involved with the Midtown project in Santa Fe and really honored to be part of this panel tonight. But when we start to think about where housing goes, really what growth in a city looks like, it's going to be informed by a lot of different inputs. So what this image is talking about is how those different considerations can start to align or overlap to help answer that question. So when we ask, where can housing go? Where can cities grow? Some of that's going to be determined by the urban form or the urban structure of a city. Where are there existing infrastructure and services that can be used to sort of efficiently deliver service to new residents? What are some of the community histories and desires that already exist in the city? How does that inform that question? And then, of course, what are the overriding policies as well? Some of the ones we've heard about in Santa Fe include, trying to be a green city and limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And there's certainly an impact that the pattern of growth has on that. This is a diagram that we had sketched out when we were first getting involved with Midtown. And you can see that sort of with this dashed outline here towards the center of the drawing. But this is just looking at some of the area around Midtown and some of the areas that are influenced by Midtown or that will influence Midtown. So not a comprehensive exercise, but again, one of our initial drawings. And what this is really meant to get at is what are the different centers that are driving growth or that can anchor growth in Santa Fe. A lot of these are employment areas. So we have things like hospital out to the east side there. Of course, a lot of economic activity downtown and around the Capitol. And then the rail runner stations as well start to create a spine where TOD style development could absorb a lot of growth in the future. Now, there's a question of what sort of impacts does that have on existing residents? What does that look like across the rest of the city? This exercise was pretty limited. But when we start to think about where growth goes, where growth can be efficient in terms of leveraging existing infrastructure, leveraging existing transportation systems, being located in a way that makes it easy to walk or take transit or bike to work, this is a pattern that could start to emerge. When we work with communities in answering this question, one of the questions we always ask is this idea of degree of change. So when we look across a city, this is an example from Memphis, Tennessee. We ask what amount of change is appropriate for different communities, what speed of change is acceptable in those communities, and what type of change do those communities need. Depending on, again, past investment, sort of to the point that was raised by Tomás, the type of change, the type of investment that a community needs is probably different across the city. If you can answer that question about what type of change is appropriate, you can start to think about how to implement that in your general plan, for example. We advocate for a place-based approach. So this is looking at existing urban form patterns, existing vernacular architecture or vernacular development patterns that reflect sort of cultural traditions and preferences in areas. And we feel really strongly that general plan level policy can start to inform that. So our approach is always place-based. This is a departure from a lot of past practice, which tends to be really, really focused on things like land use or density. But we're interested in asking, how can those things be contextually sensitive? How can policy understand the relationship between places, both in terms of the built form and in terms of sort of what function those places provide within the larger city context. So again, I think we're big advocates of integrating this type of thinking into your policy documents, into your general plan. These are some examples that we prepared in different communities. Again, general plan level policy guidance that starts to be really specific about what different parts of a city could look like, what development should look like there. Because when you can start to answer that, you can really start to speak to how it's serving the people who live in those places, how it's serving their needs for housing or employment, but also how it's contributing to bigger goals such as walkability, such as high quality public realm, reflecting sort of cultural development patterns. So when we get to Santa Fe, there's this question of, what does that look like for Santa Fe? How's the city going to grow? Typically, in a lot of places, I think Santa Fe isn't unique in this respect. I think this applies there as well. What the market can deliver is sort of detached single-family houses or larger apartment buildings. Now, not as big as this in Santa Fe, but those are sort of your two options. You might get townhouses sometimes as well. When you think about how a city can grow, typically, a default answer has been sort of suburban expansion. So this is one of the least efficient ways to grow because you're having to put in all new infrastructure, and it's detrimental to sort of agricultural land or natural land. The alternative to that in many cities is to add density to your core. So look at downtown areas, look at major corridors, add density there. There tends to be less opposition to growth in those places, and there tends to be existing infrastructure that you can build off of. What I want to talk about tonight, though, is sort of this third way, and that's adding density gently to neighborhoods using what we call missing middle housing. And these are some historic examples from Santa Fe, just around downtown. So the idea isn't new in Santa Fe. You've got duplexes, you've got things like cottage courts, but in a lot of cases, existing zoning might not necessarily support this type of development. We're especially intrigued with this. We actually participated in a competition in 2009 to design courtyard housing for Santa Fe. So this is an 8-unit building that was designed for the West Side Guadalupe Historic District. The plan won, but unfortunately it was never built, but it's just meant to demonstrate that multi-unit housing can be contextually sensitive and it can fit in with existing neighborhoods. So what is missing middle housing? I think we always start with this question of what's getting built in a city, what's not getting built, and who misses out when these are the only two type of products that get delivered. Missing middle is sort of everything between the single family home and larger mixed use apartment buildings. So these are things like triplexes, bungalow courts, townhouses, duplexes. We call them missing because very few of them get built. This is due to a variety of reasons in terms of financing, sort of developer familiarity, but to a point that was raised earlier, a lot of it has to do with regulatory barriers as well in terms of what's allowed under zoning. So we define this idea of missing middle as house scale buildings. So these are buildings that look like they could be large single family homes, but they actually contain multiple units, and they're most successful when they're in walkable neighborhoods. This idea of house scale, again, it's a building that's about the same dimensions as what you'd expect to find in a larger single family home. The idea here is that these multi-unit types can fit in existing lower density neighborhoods. So it's a way to gently densify existing neighborhoods, adding housing in those areas. We really emphasize scale. We think it matters a lot because there's a question of what's an appropriate scale. These two images show the same site, but they show different scales of infill. The densities aren't completely dissimilar in either of these cases. Again, most of the time, the block scale infill example on the left is what you get because that's what your zoning sort of incentivizes in many cases. But there might be opportunity to sort of rethink that and look at a different scale, sort of the house scale, missing middle scale on the right. Some quick examples here. When we talk about missing middle, we think about duplex, a fourplex, think about a multiplex, so slightly larger. These slides have some density numbers, so it can be interesting to sort of compare that and see how that compares to existing existing neighborhoods, existing zones in Santa Fe, for example. A lot of these buildings could be contextually appropriate in terms of the size and scale with existing neighborhoods, but they might not be allowed because of the zoning requirements. So this is a 115 unit per acre building, but the building itself isn't that large. It just means that there are lots of small units in there. And a lot of times, smaller units can be one of many ways to deliver more affordable housing in a city. Accessory dwelling units or carriage houses are also a big part of that. And just wanted to throw in here quickly this example of a project that we're working on in Omaha, really different market than Santa Fe, obviously, but this is a new missing middle neighborhood that we're helping to build. These buildings are on the same block. So if you take a right-hand turn after those townhouses, you'll come across this other house. And the point here is that this neighborhood is going to offer a really wide variety of rents. So you can expect a pretty economically diverse community in this place. So to wrap things up, some questions about how do you regulate for missing middle? If I've said that regulation is a big barrier to missing middle, here are some of the causes of that. The number one issue is when density is sort of the primary regulating tool, because it's going to look really different depending on how it's designed. So both of these examples have the same density, about 30 units per acre, but at the end of the day, they look really different, and that's based on the building scale. It's based on the design, but density alone isn't going to guarantee that you get one or the other. And if one of these is more acceptable than the other, then you need some sort of zoning mechanism that could guarantee that, or that could support that. Same idea here. Both of these are 4-unit buildings. The presence on the street is very different. The way that they contribute to the public realm in the neighborhood, the extent to which they sort of contribute to the look and feel of a neighborhood is really different, even though they're delivering the same number of housing units. So at Opticos, we're big advocates for form-based codes. This is a different way to structure a zoning code. Lots of zoning codes, again, they're based on land use and density. Form-based code starts to look at different elements of building design, building form. There's a lot of emphasis on predictable built results because it's more detailed. It's easier both for a developer to know what the community wants, and it's easier for the community to understand what their zoning code is going to produce. There's an emphasis on a high quality public realm. So how does the building impact the experience of the pedestrian along the sidewalk, for example? And again, they focus on physical form rather than separation of uses. Just to wrap things up here, because I know I'm a little over time, the sort of organizing principle of a form-based code, I think, works actually really well in Santa Fe. It's sort of predicated on this idea of a transect. So that's establishing a spectrum from the most natural, undeveloped parts of a city to the most urban developed parts of the city. And we know Santa Fe sort of has this whole range, and it's meant to focus the organization of zones, again, less on this idea of really different uses, but more on a spectrum so that you do get some transitions in intensity, and there's more of a focus on the built form, the experience of a space through a form-based code. So we do have a new book out just now. If you're interested in learning more about missing middle, this was a super fast presentation, but you can definitely learn more about that there and our website as well. So thank you so much.
Drew, thank you so much. Thank you very much for laying out some interesting ways to think about regulation, to think about how we can approach development in innovative ways based on community values and needs. So next we have Joel Mills. Joel, you can start sharing your screen whenever you're able. And remember to ask some questions in the Q&A area. We'll try to get to those pretty shortly. Joel is a senior director at the American Institute of Architects Center for Communities by Design, which provides pro bono technical assistance for community success. Joel has delivered consultative services to hundreds of communities around the world, and he's focused on urban democracy, civic capacity, and public processes. He's a founding board member of the International Association for Public Participation's United States chapter, was a co-convener at the Remaking Cities Conference, and is an academician at the Academy of Urbanism in London, UK. Joel, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carlos. So obviously, my expertise is in civic health and public participation, not housing. So I'm sure some of you are asking at this point, what's this guy here for? So I'm going to answer the question, what in the world does public participation have to do with housing? And I want to underline here the tremendous positive opportunity that we have, because despite all the negative rhetoric around land use and housing conversations in the United States, you just consider what we've all experienced in the last year. We've had the most broad-based civil rights movement in our country's history, followed by a national election that had higher voter participation than we've ever had before. So our citizens are engaged, explanation point, right? So the opportunity is before us now to have some of these critical conversations that we haven't had before, and to do it where it matters most in our communities. And what better topic than housing? Every single jurisdiction in America is facing a housing crisis. This is hot off the press this week, the National League of Cities State of the Cities report. No one will be surprised that housing comes up twice in their top negative conditions that local officials point to in the last year. Prices are at record levels. They're going up in most jurisdictions. Affordable housing supply and rental prices are a big problem, and its cascading impacts, especially for our most vulnerable communities, are dramatic, right? And we have the capacity to solve these issues, right? This is just one illustration that comes from DC back in World War II, right? In a 5-year period in the 40s, our region doubled its population, and the city gained over 200,000 residents. And they didn't accommodate that successfully without all of the above strategy, right? So of course there was a lot of new build, but they also not only relaxed existing regulations around things like accessory dwelling units, but they incentivized those things. So you had, front porches being converted, garages being converted, it became sort of a point of civic pride to participate in that housing issue. And it's not something that you're going to necessarily say, oh, we want to do that in Santa Fe now, but it's the kind of thinking, that creative thinking, that's important as we approach, the housing issue, because, so much of the outcomes we're experiencing are locally controlled, right? We control those land use policies. So, it's sort of the classic argument for systems reform, if I've ever seen it. If every single local jurisdiction that controls their own land use has somehow, come to the point where we all have a housing crisis, it's time to think in different ways, right? The most unsustainable thing in America right now is our self-destructive politics and civic life. No one will find these statistics surprising in any way. 93% of us consider it a problem, right? But what I do want to focus in on are the costs, right? Because especially when it comes to housing, this unhealthy dialogue we have around our land use and housing policy is leading to some really negative outcomes, right? So the top left image comes from Austin, Texas. Austin had a big citywide rezoning effort, multi-year, $6 to $8 million spent, that just produced conflict, right? And these are signs from opposing sides of this conflict over the rezoning. At the end of the day, they just pulled the plug on the whole thing, right? And so they haven't done anything to accommodate affordable housing, new kind of land use policy, and they're doubling their population. So you can imagine what that's doing to prices, right? And this is not uncommon. You can see the other statistics there. Over time, this becomes, incredible costs that are working class families, it represents money that's not in their pocket, right? The image on the right is actually now a book, but was a study of 97 municipalities in Massachusetts. They looked at public meeting participation and its connection to housing, right? And so, of course, what did they find? Again, no surprise, the participation in public meetings wasn't representative, right? It tended to be older, whiter, wealthier, and people from advantaged neighborhoods, right? And they were overwhelmingly against new housing projects. So what happened? Those didn't occur. They were defeated, and that has impact on housing prices, of course. But then it has a secondary impact, because where do developers eventually find a place for their project, they find it in a neighborhood that doesn't have as big a voice. So they go to the most vulnerable area of the community to successfully build their project. And of course, it then gentrifies, that community. If you've been able to put the housing project in the wealthy community, it could have absorbed it without any of those negative impacts, but now you've sort of doubled down, right? And so, this is happening all over America, and a lot of it is related to how we're structuring our conversations, and how we talk in the community about any given issue. So this is sort of a visual representation of just public opinion on a generic issue in any community, right? You've got sort of this bell curve representation most of the time. So you always have your extremes on either side, right? For something, against something, but most people are somewhere in the middle. But what happens when you have poorly designed processes that lead to conflict, that engender conflict in a lot of cases, you get a lot of frustration, and people in that larger mass, right, start to fall out of participation, right? So in a healthy process, those people, you've got the extremes, but they're pushed to the margins, of course. They may be louder, but it's a smaller group. And the deliberation among the middle group leads to much more moderate policies that have broad public support rather than the big ugly fight. But when that middle drops out and you just have the extremes going at it, how that turns out. It gets uglier and uglier. It becomes, personalized. And at some point you get to things being framed like this. And, I'm cheating here. This is satire. This is The Onion, right? I've used this in front of big audiences, and it always gets a laugh at first. And then it begins to dawn on them, there's a lot of truth in their community about how things are getting framed, right? How their conversations are getting framed. And, there are more ridiculous examples right now over things than this headline, right? So, there's Zucchini Gate in Berkeley, where a 2-story, residential proposal was defeated by the next door neighbor who showed up with her zucchini and said it was going to, shade the garden and kill the garden off. I'm working with a community in California this year. It's a seniors community. The average age is 75, and yet someone ended up with a dismembered rat in their mailbox over heated conflict there, right? There's nothing funny about that, right? And nothing appropriate. And so this is kind of the narrative of decline that we're seeing in a lot of our communities, where you have public processes that don't meet expectations, leads to frustration, people start to drop out. And so you get more dominance by the extreme voices, right? On both sides of every issue. And that leads to a decline in dialogue, more politicization, personalization of conflict, and then at some point, actually a fear by a lot of local governments of dealing with the public because it's so ugly and they don't know how to change, to sort of bend the curve on that. And so, I took a look at Santa Fe. These are all quotes and headlines from various conversations that are public and in your newspapers. And unfortunately, I see, if I go back to the dynamics that are here, I see a lot of them present. This is not scientific. I'm not, putting judgment on your community. I think Santa Fe has a lot of fantastic civic things going for it, but you also have some warning signs, right? Because there's personalization of conflict here, a lot of complaints about processes, threats of litigation, fear of the public, it's all there, right? So this is something that if you want to really solve the housing crisis is going to need to be addressed, right? So how do we begin to do that? There are, in fact, a lot of resources out there. Carlos mentioned my affiliation with IAP2. It's an international organization for public participation, chapters all over the world, and they have sort of this 7-point criteria. Any process that exhibits these criteria, you're going to have a successful outcome in general. I want to sort of key in on these 4 aspects, though. They're all represented in the criteria, but this is when we get into what's going sort of off the rails in a lot of our communities, it's around these 4 things. One is representation, which I already kind of touched upon in examples, But when we get into designing processes, too many of us are expecting them on our terms, right? We're going to organize a meeting and people are going to come, and that's the public we work with, instead of understanding the community that we're working with and designing processes to actively engage and make sure we're involving the entire community in that process. Second, we're not holding processes that educate. And I'm not talking about sort of the sales job on a development proposal. I'm talking about the context, right? So, the context of housing, right? How are we educating the public through a public process so that there's informed judgment about the public decisions and choices, in front of us? There's way too much of either, what we call public relations versus public participation, where you have an agenda or you're only listening to what you want to hear piece, instead of really trying to address both, what the values and character of a community are and what its needs are, right? And balancing with some nuance those elements. Third thing is being deliberative, right? So we just have fights. We're designing processes that just lead to conflict, and there's a science around holding well-designed processes that allow, every community has diverse opinions, right? Allow those diverse opinions to be presented so that everyone builds understanding of those differences. And what happens by the end of a process is that you get more moderate viewpoints and a greater understanding, greater legitimacy for the ultimate decisions that take place. And finally, having a meaningful process. You're going to participate in something. We all want to see our contributions influence, the direction of that process, where they go. And I want to be told, how that's happening. I want it to be shown to me at the end, right? So I'm not going to get into these specific tools. There are a lot of tools out there. The image is another tool from IEP2, but there are some trendy things. The first couple mechanisms are trending a lot of communities right now to deal with some of these issues. Credible third party, fully trained people. IEP2 has a great training program on public participation. The key point is, how do we reframe our public conversations for healthy dialogue? So I'm going to end with, this is one recent example, just came out this week from Nova Scotia, right? So Canada, where they have already said, housing is a human right, but that didn't change the housing reality. And they've got some crazy things happening, just like the US, there's a developer there that has, looked at construction costs and said, that's, not the business model. The business model is now, we're going to go buy up all these single family homes in districts that have ADU available, and we're gonna flip, make them multifamily, and they're going to invest $1 billion and take 4,000 homes off the market. So this is kind of a scary thing, right? But the point is that at some point, if you're going to take on this issue, you have to have the hard public conversations. And I'm not well versed in the process they had. You can kind of see how many people are involved. But I really like the way they frame the questions, especially that third one. How can we all, how can everybody who's involved in affecting housing work better together across sectors? So back to the earlier points that everybody's been making, that this is going to take a community solution. Absolutely, absolutely. And this commission worked 6 months, involved 2,000 people. They've issued very bold recommendations. They want $25 million from, I think, the provincial government immediately, right? And there's like 6 recommendations. So it is serious work, but it has involved the public and really leaned on the true experiences of what people are going through to inform its work. That's what we need, and that kind of work in every community. So, bottom line is, what in the world does public participation have to do with housing? It has everything to do with it, and getting that right is a prerequisite for solving our housing challenges. Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Joel, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. We're going to start to move into questions. So there's an incredible amount of information we've already got into. There's a lot of difficult situations here And we're not going to be able to get into everything all at once. There's also tons of resources out, various housing advocacy, technical experts, community engagement experts have posted. So I do want to make sure that the individuals are looking into those various reports. Some of those are local, some of those are from outside of our community. But without any further ado, Anthony, let me turn this over to you, and why don't you start asking the panel some questions?
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Jennifer and Tomás, for these diverse points of view. This is exactly what what is needed to kind of look at this housing problem. I appreciate Carlos kind of selecting this particular panel and putting together a conversation that's focused on community-based solutions, right? And these are different facets of getting there to community-based solutions, whether that's public process, design, or design-based regulation, market versus regulation, issues of race and civil rights and housing. I think these are all important and key factors here. I'm going to try to cut to the chase a little bit on this issue of community-based solutions for Santa Fe, by way of an example that came through this week, and kind of pose that to the panel, and maybe we can kind of fit a lot of our audience questions under this. Earlier this week, AIA Los Angeles and led by some of the best kind of practitioners in terms of low-income affordable housing and homeless housing in Los Angeles, which is a notoriously difficult regulatory environment, put together a call to action and sent it to Mayor Garcetti. And it had 7 points in it, all of them kind of based on LA solutions. And this is not to suggest that architects are the only ones with the answers, but I thought this was pretty telling in terms of the kind of wide variety of tools that they were suggesting were key things to support in their community. And they included, advancing inclusive zoning practices, repealing down zoning, modifying height requirements upwards, adopting new models of housing, including substandard square footages for unit sizes as standard in the city, removing financing hoops, streamlining permitting, and asking the mayor to petition the federal government for additional funding on certain programs. This is a pretty powerful statement, and one that really kind of attempted to really tackle problems in LA right now. There certainly are probably other concerns too, but this seemed to be a kind of broad-based call. First question to this group, what would a call look like to those running for mayor this fall in Santa Fe? What would be for each of you, what are your key kind of items or action items on the housing front?
I'm happy to start. So we had mentioned that Chainbreaker is doing a series of reports on evictions. Mm-hmm. The third one will be coming out in about a month, and we'll list a slate of policy recommendations for the immediate, the mid, and the long term. So it'll be dealing with how to deal with the eviction crisis in the today, and then also what do we do to avoid this kind of thing in the future, which will include things like really figuring out how we can essentially insulate people who are vulnerable to market forces, to these erratic limbs of the market, how we can make sure that people are able to stay housed, to access housing in the first place for folks that don't, and to do that in the long term. So I would say look for that report when it comes out, and certainly, Chainbreaker is a 501c3 organization, but we will work with whatever administrations are out there, but we will certainly be interested in what they think about those reports and moving forward. I think in general, we're looking at things like an increase of community control, not just of the end result of something. So what gets built on a place like Midtown, for instance, we want to see that community control through things like community land trusts or just other types of models that are about collective stewardship. But we also want to see that collective control and responsibility for the process by which that happens. And we're really encouraged to see some of that Starting now, like I mentioned in the presentation, there's been a shift towards how people are talking about before it was all about, oh my God, there's an expense here, as opposed to it's an investment in the community, which is what we believe in how people are talking. So we would love to see more of that for no matter who's going to be on council and in the governing body coming up. But that's the short story. The long story, check out our report.
So I can attack that one. I think the city, it comes down to values, and housing is not only important just from a human rights standpoint, but it is so critical to the economic health of this community and having a diversified economy. And I think Santa Fe is poised to to not be so focused on and not so dependent on tourism and dependent on these lower paying service jobs. That's always going to be an element of things, and that's fine. But if we can get this right, I think that Santa Fe is poised to really start generating some very interesting stuff around employment and around higher paying jobs, skilled jobs. And but right now, the housing piece is a big barrier. So it's about deciding that's important and for all the reasons, and then the city really getting aggressive about the tools that are available to them. There are some limitations around anti-donation, but they need to unpack that and really understand relative to the state statutes that are applicable here. They need to say, these are, there's so many economic development tools that the city does not avail themselves of. And they have been, really, and they're starting to do more. We're seeing a little more with, IRBs and different, I'm working on, potentially a couple of PIDs with the city. But there's a lot that is available to them, and they're gonna have to prioritize it financially. And looking at those sources of revenue, the private sector is a great source of revenue. There are developers, if they can have some predictability in their process, they will pay for the privilege and they will pay fees for the privilege. And so looking at those revenue sources and how can those funds be strategically deployed in terms of leveraging them and leveraging their real estate assets and looking at, land swaps and looking at the Northwest Quadrant. The city, engaged in hundreds of thousands of dollars and hours in community process around the Northwest Quadrant, which is a huge area that could be deployed around housing. There are some challenges over there relative to transportation and relative to utilities, but it was the adjacent neighborhood that killed it. And that master plan went nowhere. So, that is the low hanging fruit. There are a lot of things that are low hanging fruit. So the city has things at their disposal and they need to get aggressive about using them.
Thanks, Jennifer. Joel, is it about having a set of action items right now, or is there more process that needs to happen?
Did you ask me that?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's both. I love that you use LA as sort of an example there. It's totally different, right? But it's a context where the housing crisis is even worse, right? So they have to think creatively. They have 60,000 homeless on the streets. So one of the things I love that they have done is, their work around ADUs, where they didn't just make them legal, but they're facilitating the entire build process and the rental process now, right? So if you live in a neighborhood and you live in a home that can be converted, there are pre-approved, they work with a number of architectural firms to come up with designs that are now pre-approved. You can select one of those designs and glide right through your permitting process, build, and they'll actually go out and facilitate finding you a legit renter as well to guarantee your income. So, it's changing the relationship with your citizens, empowering them as a part of the solution, and it's mitigating, issues in vulnerable neighborhoods where, it's becoming less and less affordable. So suddenly you get the extra income stream with the renter, and you're bringing in a renter at oftentimes below market as well. So you're doubling sort of the good stuff there. So that low-hanging fruit is great. But I think that, we need both the immediate low-hanging fruit stuff to move, and we need, to set the table, right? Bring every sector together, the private sector, the nonprofit, and the public sector, to have a strategic conversation about building a real partnership so that things can happen at a meaningful scale, right? Otherwise it's drips in a bucket, right? There is another way to come at it from the community side. Philadelphia, years ago now, had several civic institutions that during their mayoral campaign had a giant public process called Great Expectations, where they literally built an agenda for the next mayor, not knowing who it would be, but advocating that whoever was going to, be that mayor, accept that agenda. And, Michael Nutter won. What a successful mayor he was for their city. And, he already had his agenda built. All he had to do was endorse, yes, I'm down with the thing that thousands of people built, so it got them off to a really great start. So I think, start the work now, the obvious low-hanging fruit should happen as fast as it can. And the bigger conversations need to start now.
Great.
To expand on that, I definitely say that, with some of the low-hanging fruit, truth and reconciliation, building trust with the community, the city has been pretty bad at that in the past. That's a long-term process, and that needs to happen in order to understand our values and in order to understand how we want to systematically and comprehensively change our regulations and how we want to be a Santa Fe. Until that time, the city can start to take, kind of as Joel was talking about with some of the low-hanging fruit, we do know that there is destructive, exclusive, racially and socioeconomically biased, expensive regulations that don't reflect community values. And I think those are things that we can start to get at until we actually get more of that community engagement that's working.
Well, so I have a question about that. I mean, so many of you tonight have talked about the need for education. Jennifer, you talked about it. Joel, you talked about it as a critical one of the 4 steps there. And we're doing events like this. There have been lots of housing discussions. We do need to get into those kind of deeper deliberations that are absolutely inclusive and kind of allow for many voices to speak. But it seems like we got to bring people into the conversation. We do need to have discussions about terminology to really kind of challenge some assumptions and do it in a way where people can be open to kind of rethinking their impressions. I'm thinking about some of the terms that were turned around tonight. One of them was negative impacts, right? What do we really mean by negative impacts, and what are we talking about? Right? Carlos pointed out that that we have this in our zoning code. Is it negative impacts on the current modes of housing? Are we really talking about how the current modes of housing are actually negatively impacting the overall availability of housing? When we talk about subsidies, and Tomás, you talked a lot about subsidies, right? Or Jennifer, you talked about trade-offs with developers. Do we need to get to do we have the space, and have any other communities been successful in educating their members about the subsidies that exist for prevailing models of housing, but aren't being applied to the ones where we really say we need them? It seems to me that we need to be very nimble, but this education process may be a long game. Am I making too big of a deal of this, or are we seeing some lights or opportunities in the communities that you all have been involved in?
Yeah, I think I could start that. Let me just say it this way, is I think education is important, but I don't think it's the only important thing. And in fact, I don't think it's actually the most important thing. From our perspective, again, and we represent Chainbreaker's members are people living right on the edge of the housing crisis or in it in the moment. And so I think that there's not a lot of education that needs to happen about the housing crisis for people that are living it in that way. I would also imagine that people who are developers and know the system also understand that. To me, the biggest obstacles are actually the political will to make things happen there. And I think that what that fundamentally boils down to is an organization like Chainbreaker that's about building power and really getting the folks who are on the front lines to have a seat at the table and to really affect that change is there. I mean, you talked about an election happening, and we're aware that every couple of years or so, people start sort of talking about the issues that we deal with every day. We need to get to a place where that happens, not on those cycles, but it happens constantly, knowing that some of the solutions are going to outlast anybody's term in there because they are decades-long approaches to some of this stuff. So I do think education is important, but I think that it's overly emphasized, and I think that it is not the most important piece of it. I saw some questions in the chat, for instance, about rent control, and that question always comes up when we're giving this presentation. And it seems like an obvious answer to a lot of people. I'm not sure that there may be difference on this call or this presentation, but certainly when Chainbreaker is talking to our members out there, that is not a controversial thing. It's a very obvious thing that needs to happen when we're dealing with predatory rent increases, when people just can't afford their rents out there. Now, what that means, though, is, again, first of all, having the political will to make something like that happen, which is a challenge. And two, to rethink about housing from a rights perspective and not so much from a financial perspective. And so I think that if we were to want to articulate something like that and figure out how we can prevent renters from dealing with those sort of predatory rent increases, that takes also a revisioning of housing. And it takes really looking at, so what are the logistical mechanisms for which that can happen, right? Because we don't, we understand that there are financial realities to building houses. So I think that we want to have more conversations like this and get down to the nitty gritty, but start off with those values at the front of it. Because if we can agree on those things, then we can find out how then we can deal with the finances. Then we can find out how to pass laws that actually protect renters and lead to community control and things like that. So I hope that answers your question. I think it may have.
No, it does. How nimble do we, and Drew, you may have some insight into this, how nimble do we need to be with all of these? I mean, we've all agreed that it's a set of tools, right? That, that get values aligned. There's a set of tools here for solving. It's not one silver bullet. It's not one item. Oftentimes in these conversations, it seems like, how are we going to fix housing? We've got to come up with something. And like a year from now or 2 years from now, we're going to have this agenda put together. And it occurs to me that none of that is true, right? It's about a constant adjustment of dials and valves for addressing a kind of constantly changing landscape. I mean, Tomás, you talked about how these statistics have changed over time. Jennifer, you talked about the market to a great extent. How, Drew, you're dealing with kind of design and density and coming into a neighborhood now versus 10 years ago and thinking about 10 years from now. How do we develop an awareness? How do we make a kind of set of tools be as nimble as possible and respond to not only the kind of current numbers, but to change over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to keep top of mind when we think about sort of like a citywide toolkit is that it has to be coordinated in some way, right? Because I think what tends to happen is that some tools get used some places, some tools get used others, and in some cases that sort of differentiation can be a good thing, but a lot of times that ends up being the case where the tools that are most acceptable to a community go to the communities with the most power, and the tools that are least attractive end up going to those communities with the least political power to stop them. So, at Opticos, we got involved in form-based codes because we're all trained as architects and we're trying to get stuff built, and we kept running into the zoning code, and that was always an issue for us. So we figured out how can we produce a better zoning code that can let us build for our clients what they're trying to build, what these communities need. From there, we then sort of kept bumping into general plans or comprehensive plans, and that's how we got involved in that. So, I think as we talk about all these discrete tools, it's also really useful to sort of follow that up to its logical conclusion, which is, how are all of these going to be coordinated? What is that guiding policy document going to look like? Carlos shared at the beginning that Santa Fe's general plan was authored in 1999, and it's been edited since then, but that's a long time ago, and a lot has changed, both in terms of like what is possible, literally with building code changes, but big market changes too, and a huge change in the conversation nationally, and I think locally as well, about what needs are and what lengths cities can now go to, with the LA example, to start to satisfy those. So, I think a big part of that, the low-hanging fruit is really important. You got to do that. But I think it's great when that can build to these bigger, longer term changes that at the end of the day are going to be sort of the engine, or, what's steering all of this.
You mentioned attractiveness of the solutions. And I'm just kind of thinking through it came out in the discussion, like that substandard housing is a term we need to talk about a little bit and understand. I'm seeing in the comments from Aurelia Rose, the point that, if you make $30,000 to $60,000 a year, and that's your income, you're not low income and you don't qualify for that. We're not even serving truly low income people under the current standards. There's some discussion about, the need for more 1-bedroom, 1-bath units in Santa Fe, right? So many people are elderly or live alone or couples. Those are things that our current housing mechanisms don't supply enough of, and they certainly don't supply enough units that are smaller and meet the income requirements of many of our residents. How do we have conversations about those kinds of things? I mean, you showed some examples where, we get density or we get the number of units, but we do it at a scale that's attractive. How do we when we talk about substandard housing, we talk about, something, let's say, Tomás, under 400 square feet unit size, people start to panic about those kinds of terms, right? Or co-housing or shared housing or family-based housing. How do we make these kind of alternative modes of housing more acceptable in the kind of broader conversation?
For me, that comes back to what I'm talking about when I say education, right? I've worked in multiple communities before where the orientation from the most impacted neighborhoods coming into that community was, we don't want any development at all, right? And here are our reasons, and they're, quality of life, view sheds, neighborhood character, all those things, right? So I'm not talking about them being fluent in development finance, technical stuff, but being able to understand scale, the scale, the feel, that reflects their values, being represented while meeting those needs, right? And what gets built. And in at least 2 communities I can think of off the top of my head, they literally shifted in a 3-day period from we're against all development to we want that, right? Because they can see in the sketch work that's done, right? And how things are represented, that it's respecting those values, right? It's honoring those values, and it's meeting the needs and penciling out, right? And that's what we need more of, because we've got, I can see it in your news, right? I can see you get a modest development proposal, and there are people coming out, with a lot of emotion talking about traffic and all the things that we hear in every community, right? And it's about having a conversation with them and showing them things like Drew presented tonight, so they understand what scale means in different contexts, right? And how to adjust the context to honor what the values of the community are while meeting needs that need to be met.
Good. Anybody else on this? On substandard? I mean, Tomás, you've talked about it a little bit too, right? I mean,
yeah, I think so again, Chainbreaker is not a developer, or, so a lot of the terms are ones that we wouldn't use in our communities. I do think it would be helpful for us to have a better sense of that. So I think that level of education, I think, is important. I think a lot of what we run into when people, what we experience in terms of a sort of clash between community and developer, and I know that this is not the same in all parts of the city or everybody's experience, but for our base and our members is really this legacy of displacement, this legacy of gentrification, this really long-rooted history of what is frankly the erasure of our people and the erasure of our history and our culture is really deeply felt in our community. And so if someone says, I want to change something, and they're not addressing that history there, it makes sense to me why people would say, yeah, well, we don't trust you. No matter what you say, we're going to say no to, because that's what we're going to default to. So, I think I think what we need to do with that is approach this through like a truth and reconciliation process and say, hey, these things happened. They're not over. They're currently happening right now. How do we address those things? That's the truth piece of it. And the reconciliation piece is saying, all right, we have the opportunity with something like Midtown to make this worse or to make it better. Let's have those real conversations. And I don't know, but I'd be willing to bet that would shift the sort of push-pull that we see between community and developer there, so we can actually have the deeper conversations about what your all's presentation was about. This is what denser housing could look like without hurting your community. I would love to be able to get to that place because our folks need housing. So yeah, I mean, I think again, that's the perspective that we bring to all of this. And so, yeah, that's where I would move with that.
Yeah.
And and I would also add, Anthony, that we have to be careful with our languaging, right? Because people have knee-jerk reactions. Things can be provocative in a way. So things like substandard. It's like all of a sudden people are envisioning a shack in the backyard with no plumbing, right? And so it's housing. It's about options. Right. And it's about housing that meets the needs of a community. And that is about diversity. And, the gentrification piece is really important. But as we saw partially through Carlos's presentation and through Tomás, is that the zoning code creates it. A Euclidean zoning situation in the city of Santa Fe, it drives gentrification, right? Because we have these areas that are just, you can't touch that. You can't go there. We're not going to do it over here. And so, we've seen some communities in the country do this, where they ditch the zoning altogether. And it's like residential is residential. And you can do and you going to more of a form base, so you in proper scale. And so you can like I love the kind of gentle density, that I love that terminology. And we have great examples of that in this community right now, because all of the neighborhoods that surround downtown are zoned R21. One of them's been downzoned, but 21 DUs per acre, because when the city of Santa Fe established their land development code, it was believed that the downtown neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that were closest to employment and services, should be dense. That was a desire back then. And so if you go into the east side, you go into South Capitol, most all of that is zoned R21. So that's how we've ended up with a lot of missing middle supply. You drive through and you have, the big house that's, you see this a lot in South Capitol, like the big 2-story house that over time, the heirs inherit it, mom passes away, kids don't want to live there. So they carve it up into multiple apartments and it becomes a little income stream. And there's basement apartments and there's this. And this was like in my 20s when I moved to Santa Fe. I mean, this was the house, everybody lived in something like that, or the converted, garage apartment, a little guest house in the backyard, or, and there's so many great examples. And these are the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. Like, you're going to tell me that a duplex next door is going to ruin your property values? I don't think there's that is not an evidence-based assumption. You see it all over the east side of Santa Fe. Big, gorgeous houses next door to little casita compounds and duplexes and little apartment buildings. And you see it in South Capitol. I mean, it's all over the place. And so we have great examples of that. That's that educational piece. That if the city wants, had the political will to move away from this, this R1, R2, R3 kind of really restrictive zoning that could allow some of this, internal densification in existing neighborhoods. We have great examples of how it organically over time just happened, and it's created really diverse, vibrant neighborhoods. And so we've already done it. So we just need to do it again.
And Jennifer, I really appreciate highlighting sort of using housing options as a way to speak about that, because I think this idea of a 400 square foot apartment, that there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? That's a really decent garage apartment size. For a lot of people that could work. It becomes problematic when you're living there not because you choose to, but because that's all you can afford, or you can't,
Sure.
You're stuck from moving on to something else. So I think this idea of options is a really critical way to frame it, because it's not, you're not having to say this is bad, this is good. You're able to say all of these different things can be good for different people, different lifestyles, different incomes, different points in their lives. But we want to make sure that all those people also have access to all these other options as well.
Mm-hmm.
And to get that, you actually have to be able to build all of those options, I think, to the point you're making.
And real quick, just to emphasize some of what you're saying, our zoning codes and our community processes, they encourage the biggest, most luxury, most expensive types of housing that we could build. That's what we're, whether we know it or not, that's what we're telling developers. We're telling developers that we want the biggest, most luxury units, and we are prohibiting other forms of that. And if we want to change that, that means we have to change our regulations.
Mm-hmm.
True.
So I think I just want to name,
Yeah.
I know we're close to the end, but what I'm hearing from everybody that I think it sounds like we all at least have a lot of unity on is really, this is a systemic issue, right? This isn't like a series of an individual choice or something. This is the way that the system is working, and it's not working for for very few amounts of people, right? And so I think that as we wrap, I want to take that and think about that and say, well, if the market's not the solution and the system is the issue, what are the ways that we can address that? So that's what I'm going to take out of this conversation.
Terrific. That's a really good note to close out on. I really thank all of you for the discussion. Sorry we have to cut the discussion a little short to end on time. We're close to time. There are lots of great questions in the box for all of the speakers. We'll share those as we leave. I do have a few closing comments, and I'm going to share my screen just to close things out. Everybody can see that, yes? So I want to thank everybody for an amazing session. Huge thank you to our panelists and their brilliant presentations and speaking with us tonight. Tomás Rivera, Jennifer Jenkins, Joel Mills, and Drew Finke. To our amazing revisioning history team, thank you, Gayla Bechtel, Chris Longley-Postema, Lisa Gavioli-Roach, and of course, tonight's host and organizer, Carlos Gemora. Special thanks to our program sponsors, Craig Hoops and Subi Bowden, as well as all of our other financial contributors. And a special thank you to Robert Innes of Rinse Design, who makes us look good with these incredible graphics. Most of all, we want to thank you, this incredible interdisciplinary audience of architects, planners, designers, developers, builders, creatives, advocates, and citizens. Thank you for being enthusiastic participants in this ongoing discussion. A few other program announcements on our tours program. A quick note about Spaces Speak. Our crowdsourced geo-mapped online tours programs has some really incredible stories that have been recently submitted about meaningful places in Santa Fe. I encourage everybody to check that out and contribute. We'd love to have more. Please enter and submit, and it's quite easy to do so. A couple images, a little bit of text or narrative. Submit yours before June 30th for a chance to win a gift card to one of these terrific Santa Fe establishments. Other upcoming events, Pechacucha Volume 11 Boundaries is Wednesday, July 21st at 6 p.m. The venue is TBD. We're currently considering a return to in-person events, or at least some of them. And with our follow-up email and e-news, we'll have a quick, very fast survey to see where you are. We'd really like to know how everybody feels about returning to in-person events. Another announcement that we just got today, the UNM Architecture School is running an Architecture and Design Summer Academy. Spacing, scaping, urbing, and zerving, new names for familiar practices. These are the hot topics that we've been talking about tonight a bit. And this is an in-person in-person academy for design-inclined high school juniors, seniors, or rising juniors, organized by the UNM School of Architecture and Planning. Session 1's in Albuquerque, starting Monday, June 21st. There's 2 or 3 spaces left in that. And then most importantly, in July, the Santa Fe session is starting. One of the amazing instructors is my colleague, Kevon Harding, but these other folks are joining them. It's $300 per person, $150 deposit to hold a place. I don't imagine there are a tremendous number of high school students on the call tonight, but if you know any, please turn them towards this program. You can go to saap.unm.edu/academic/ADSA, or simply email adsa@unm.edu. Once again, thank you for participating in our events. Friends is the only nonprofit organization in Santa Fe with an interdisciplinary focus on design of the built environment. Our events offer opportunities and a forum for connection, mutual education, discussion, and ideation and advocacy. If you like what we do and you can afford to do so, please support us with a financial contribution to sustain our efforts. You can do that by going to our website, architecturesantafe.org. As always, thank you for being a friend, and we will see you soon.